Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Out of My Life by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. We present this audiobook in 24 parts. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Chapter 3: Work in Peacetime.
With a rich fund of experiences in every military sphere, we had returned home from French soil. With the single fatherland, we had created a single army, the fundamental form of which was only affected superficially by the demands of state particularism. Uniformity of military plans was now assured as effectively as uniformity of organization, armament, and training. It was in the natural course of German development that Prussian experience and the Prussian system should have decisive weight in the reconstruction of the army. Peace training was again resumed in all quarters. For the next few years I was still employed on regimental duty. I then followed my own inclination for a higher military training, sat for the Kriegsakademie, and was duly accepted in 1878. The first year did not quite come up to my expectations. Instead of studying military history and the lessons of recent battles, we were mostly regaled on the history of the art of war and the tactics of earlier days. These were secondary matters. In addition, we were compelled to take mathematics, which only a few of us would require later in the form of trigonometry in the survey department. It was only with the last 2 years and his posting to other arms that the ambitious young officer could be completely satisfied. Then it was that my horizon was materially extended, thanks to the guidance of splendid teachers, of whom I must mention, in addition to Major von Wittich, Colonel Ketzler, and Captain Villaume of the General Staff, as well as the historians Geheimrat Dunker and Professor Richter, and in company with gifted contemporaries such as the later Field Marshals von Billow and von Eichhorn, as well as the later General von Bernhardi. The many-sided social life of Berlin also comes into the picture. I had the honor to be invited into the exclusive circle of His Royal Highness Prince Alexander of Prussia, and thereby came into touch not only with leading soldiers, but also with men of science as well as those in the state and court service. When my time at the Kriegsakademie came to an end, I first returned to my regiment at Hanover for 6 months, and then in the spring of 1877 was attached to the General Staff. In April 1878 my transfer to the General Staff followed, and I was promoted to the rank of captain. A few weeks later I was posted to the headquarters staff of the 2nd Army Corps at Stettin. My military career outside regimental duty begins at this point, for subsequently I was only twice employed with troops until I was appointed to the command of a division. The General Staff was certainly one of the most remarkable structures within the framework of our German army. Side by side with the distinctly hierarchical form of the commands, it constituted a special element which had its foundation in the great intellectual prestige of the Chief of Staff of the Army, Field Marshal Count von Moltke. The peace training of the General Staff officer offered a guarantee that in case of war, all the commanders in the field should be controlled from a single source, and all their plans governed by a common aim. The influence of the General Staff on those commanders was not regulated by any binding order. It depended far more on the military and personal qualities of the individual officer. The first requirement of the General Staff officer was that he should keep his own personality and actions entirely in the background. He had to work out of sight and therefore be more than he seemed to be. I believe that, taking it all round, the German General Staff has known how to perform its extraordinarily difficult tasks. Its achievements were masterly to the last, though there may have been mistakes and failures in individual cases. I could imagine no more honorable testimony in its favor than the fact that the enemy has demanded its dissolution in the peace conditions. It has been suggested in many quarters that there was something mysterious about the work of the General Staff. Nothing more preposterous could be imagined. As has been the case with all our military achievements, those of the General Staff are the result of the application of sound reasoning to the immediate problem in hand. Accordingly, it is often necessary for the General Staff officer to turn his attention to all sorts of trivial affairs as well as to high military questions. I have known many most gifted officers who failed in this respect, and were therefore useless as general staff officers, or proved themselves a positive disadvantage to the troops in that capacity. As I was the youngest staff officer at Corps headquarters, I was naturally mainly occupied with these smaller matters. That was very disappointing for me at first, but then I subsequently acquired a love for the work, because I recognized its importance for the execution of the larger plans and the welfare of the troops. It was only in the annual General Staff rides that I had a chance of interesting myself in higher matters, in my capacity as the handyman of the Corps commander. At this time, I also took part in the first Fortress General Staff ride at Königsberg, conducted by General Count Waldersee, Chief of Staff of the 10th Army Corps. My Corps commander was General Hans von Weihern, an experienced soldier who had fought in the service of Schleswig-Holstein in his youth, commanded a cavalry division in 1866 and an infantry division in 1870-71. It was a real pleasure to see the old officer, a magnificent rider, on horseback in the uniform of his Blucher hussars. To both my chiefs of staff, Colonel von Petersdorf at first, and then Lieutenant Colonel von Zingler, I owe my thanks for a thorough training in practical general staff work. In the year 1879, the Second Corps had Kaiser maneuvers and received the thanks of His Majesty. It was on this occasion that I met the Russian General Skobelev, who was then at the pinnacle of his fame after the war with Turkey. He gave me the impression of a man of ruthless energy, alert of mind, and undoubtedly a very efficient higher commander. His habit of boasting was a less pleasant characteristic. I must not omit from my story the fact that I had been married at Stettin. My wife, too, is a soldier's child, being the daughter of General von Sperling, who was Chief of Staff of the 6th Corps in 1866 and Chief of Staff of the 1st Army in 1870-71. He had died after the war with France. I found in my wife a loving mate who shared with me loyally and untiringly my joys and sorrows, my cares and labors. She presented me with a son and 2 daughters. The son did his duty in the Great War as an officer on the General Staff. Both daughters are married, and their husbands likewise fought in the Great War. In 1881, I was transferred to the 1st Division at Königsberg. This change gave me greater independence, brought me into closer contact with the troops, and took me back to my native province. Of the events of my military life, there I must specially mention the fact that the well-known military writer, General von Verdi du Venois, was for a time my general. The general was a highly gifted and interesting personality. As a result of his wealth of experience in high staff posts during the wars of 1866 and 1870-71, he possessed an extraordinary knowledge of the decisive events of that period. Further, he had previously been attached to the headquarters of the Russian army in Warsaw during the Polish Rising of 1863, and had thus gained a deep insight into the political conditions on our eastern frontier. What he had to tell about his life, and he had brilliant powers of description, was therefore extremely instructive, not only from the military, but also from the political point of view. General von Verdi was a pioneer in the domain of applied war techniques. Under his guidance and in the mutual exchange of ideas, I learnt very much that was to be useful to me later on when I was myself teaching at the Kriegsakademie. This brilliant man thus had a most inspiring influence upon me in many directions. He was always a kind superior who gave me his fullest confidence. I have also grateful memories of Colonel von Bartenwerfer, the Chief of Staff of my Corps at that time. His General Staff rides and exercises for the winter syllabus of the General Staff were masterly conceptions, and his criticisms were particularly instructive. After 3 years on the staff of the 1st Division, I was transferred to the command of a company in the 58th Infantry Regiment, stationed at Fraustadt in Posen. In this return to regimental duty, I was taking charge of a company which was recruited almost exclusively from Poles. I thus learned to know the very great difficulties which the ignorance of officers and men of each other's tongue placed in the way of a good understanding between them. I myself did not know Polish, except for a few expressions which I had picked up in childhood. It was thus very difficult for me to have any influence on the company, and it was made even more difficult by the fact that the men were distributed in 33 civilian billets, even including the windmills on the outskirts of the town. Taking it all round, however, my experiences with Polish recruits were not unfortunate. The men were industrious, willing, and, what I must particularly emphasize, devoted so long as I bore in mind their difficulties in learning their work, and also did all I could for their welfare. At that time, I considered that the somewhat marked frequency of cases of theft and drunkenness among the Poles was due far less to any moral inferiority than to unsatisfactory training in early years. It is a matter of sincere regret that I have been compelled to revise my favorable opinion of the Poles of Posen, since I have heard of all the horrors which the insurgents have perpetrated upon non-combatants. I could never have expected that from the countrymen of my old fusiliers. My thoughts travel back pleasantly even today to the time, unfortunately only 5 years and a quarter, when I was commanding a company. For the first time I was familiarized with life in a small semi-rural garrison. Besides the comrades of my circle, I found a kind welcome in the neighboring estates, and I was once again in direct contact with the men. I admit I took great pains to know the peculiarities of each individual, and thus knit a firm bond between myself and those under me. For that reason I found it very hard to part from my company, in spite of the apparent advantages my recall to the General Staff brought me. This event occurred in the summer of 1885, when I was transferred to the Great General Staff. A few weeks later I was a major. I was in the department of Colonel Count von Schlieffen, subsequently General and Chief of the General Staff of the Army, but I was also placed at the disposal of the department of Colonel Vogel von Falkenstein, who was subsequently Corps Commander of the 8th Army Corps, and then Director of the Corps of Engineers and Pioneers. In this latter department, I cooperated for more than a year in the first working out of the Field Service Regulations, a fundamental code of instruction issued by His Majesty's command. I thus came into touch with the most distinguished departmental heads of that time. In the spring of 1886, His Royal Highness, Prince William of Prussia, took part in the maneuvers at Zossen, which lasted several days. These were intended to provide a practical test of the soundness of the new regulations before they were actually introduced. It was the first time I had the honor of meeting him who later was to be my Kaiser, King and Master, William II. In the following winter, the Prince attended a war game of the Great General Staff. On this occasion, I was the commander of the Russian army. It was in these years that Field Marshal Count von Moltke handed over all direct business with the departments of the Great General Staff to his assistant, General Count Waldersee. But in spite of the change, his spirit and prestige still governed everything. No special guarantee was required that Count Moltke should at all times be held in infinite honor, or that any of us could forget his wonderful influence. In the circumstances I have described, I myself seldom came into immediate official contact with the Field Marshal, but I was fortunate enough to meet him unofficially from time to time. At a dinner party in the house of Prince Alexander, I once witnessed a scene which throws an interesting light both on his views and his personality. After dinner, we were looking at a picture by Camphausen, representing the meeting of Prince Frederick Charles with the Crown Prince on the battlefield of Königgrätz. General von Winterfeld, who was present, told us from his personal knowledge that at the moment of the meeting, Prince Frederick Charles had said to the Crown Prince, "Thank God you've come, Fritz, or it would probably have gone hard with me." As Winterfeld said this, Count Moltke, who was just then choosing a cigar, came up to us in 3 great strides and said very emphatically, "The prince needn't have said that. He knew quite well that the Crown Prince had been summoned and was to be expected on the battlefield about midday, so that victory was certain." With these words, the Field Marshal returned to the cigars. On the occasion of the Emperor's birthday, the generals and officers of the General Staff were the guests of the Field Marshal. At one of these gatherings, one of the gentlemen asserted that Moltke's toast of the Kaiser would not contain more than 10 words, including the speech and the first Hoch. Bets were laid. I myself did not take any part. The gentleman who took the bet lost, for the Field Marshal merely said, "Meine Herren der Kaiser hoch," Gentlemen, hoch der Kaiser. Words which were certainly enough in our circle, and coming from such a mouth. The same bet was to have been made the next year, but the other side would not close. He would have won this time, for Count Moltke said, Meine Herren, seine Majestat der Kaiser und König lebe hoch. Gentlemen, I give you the toast of His Majesty the Kaiser and King. That makes 11 words with the first hoch. On the other hand, in the ordinary relations of life, Count Moltke was not at all uncommunicative, but a charming and challenging conversationalist with a great sense of humor. In the year 1891, I saw the Field Marshal for the last time. It was on his deathbed. I was permitted to see him the morning after he had passed peacefully away. He lay in his coffin as if asleep and without his usual wig, so that his splendid head could be seen to perfection. Only a laurel wreath round his temples was wanted to complete the picture of an ideal Caesar head. How many great thoughts had emanated from that brain! What a lofty idealism had had its seat there! What nobility of mind had dwelt there to work unselfishly for the welfare of our fatherland and its sovereign! In my opinion, our people have not since produced his equal in intellect and character. Yes, Moltke's greatness was unique in its combination of these qualities. Our first emperor, a great emperor, had left us 3 years before. I took part in the vigil in the cathedral and was permitted to render the last services there to my imperial and royal master, whom I so dearly loved. My thoughts took me through Memel, Königgrätz, and Sedan to Versailles. They culminated in the memory of a Sunday in the previous year on which I had stood under the historic corner window of the imperial palace in the midst of a jubilant throng. Carried away by the general enthusiasm, I held up my 5-year-old son and showed him our aged master with the words, "If you never forget this moment, as long as you live, you will always do right." The great soul of a great man and sovereign had departed to the comrades to whom he had sent his greeting a few years before by the dying Field Marshal von Roon. There is a block of gray marble on my desk. It comes from the very spot in the old cathedral on which the coffin of my emperor had been laid. No more valued present could have been made to me. I need not attempt to clothe in words the thoughts which rise within me, even today, when I look at that piece of stone. His son, the Emperor Frederick, Germany's pride and hope, was permitted to reign for but a short time. He died of an incurable disease a few months after his father. The great General Staff was then away on a General Staff ride in East Prussia. We therefore took the oath to His Majesty the Emperor and King, William II, in Gumbinnen. I thus pledged my fealty to my present warlord in the same spot at which 26 years later I was to translate it into action. Fate was kind to me in that I found a very great variety of employment within the General Staff. Even while I was attached to the great General Staff, I was assigned the duty of teaching tactics at the Kriegsakademie. I derived great pleasure from this work, and continued it for 5 years. It is true that the demands on me were very great, as in addition to this, I had to do other work simultaneously, both in the great General Staff and subsequently as the first General Staff officer with the headquarters staff of the 3rd Army Corps. In these circumstances, the day of 24 hours often seemed too short. It was quite usual for me to work the whole night through. I got to know many gifted young officers who justified the brightest hopes during this period when I was teaching at the Academy. Many of their names now belong to history. I can only mention here Lauenstein, Lutwitz, Freitag Loringhoven, Stein, and Hutier. 2 Turkish General Staff officers were also under me for about 2 years at this time, Shakir Bey and Tevfik Effendi. The first became a marshal in his own country, the second a general. At the headquarters staff of the 3rd Corps, my general was General von Bronsart the Younger, a very gifted officer who had been employed on the General Staff in 1866 and 1870 to 71, and subsequently, like his elder brother, became War Minister. My transfer to the War Ministry in 1889 brought me a totally different sphere of work. I there took over a section of the Common War Department. This change is attributable to the circumstance that my former divisional general, General von Verdi, had become War Minister and summoned me to the ministry when he remodeled it. I was therefore director of a section when I was still a major. Although at the start this change did not correspond to my wishes and inclinations, I subsequently attached a very high value to the experience I gained by my occupation with affairs and a sphere of work which had hitherto been unknown to me. I had plenty of opportunity of becoming acquainted with formality and red tape, which are scarcely altogether avoidable, and the bureaucratic attitude of the minor officials. But I also came to realize the strong sense of duty with which everyone was imbued, though working at the highest pressure. The most stimulating part of my work was the issue of field engineering regulations and the initiation of the use of heavy artillery in an ordinary action. Both stood the test of the Great War. Everything that was done in peace as well as, and more particularly in the recent war, deserves the highest recognition. But only a calm, judicial, and expert investigation will confirm the justness of that view. But although I came to realize that my employment at the War Ministry had been extremely valuable to me, I was nonetheless very glad to be freed from the bureaucratic yoke when I was appointed to the command of the 91st Infantry Regiment at Oldenburg in 1893. The position of commander of a regiment is the finest in the army. The commander sets the stamp of his personality on the regiment, and it is the regiment which carries on tradition in the army. The training of his officers, not only in service, but also in social matters, and the control and supervision of the training of the troops are his most important tasks. I endeavored to cultivate a sense of chivalry among my officers, and efficiency and firm discipline in my battalions. I also fostered the love of work and independence side by side with a high ideal of service. The fact that infantry, artillery, and cavalry were all comprised in the garrison gave me an opportunity for frequent exercises with combined arms. Their Royal Highnesses, the Grand Duke and Grand Duchess, were very gracious to me, and the same applies to the heir and his wife. Indeed, I found a kindly reception everywhere, and thoroughly enjoyed myself in the garden-like town. The quiet, homely character of the Oldenburg people appealed to me. I have pleasant and grateful memories of my time amongst them. By the favor of my emperor, on my 70th birthday, I was once more, to my great joy, brought into touch with my old regiment by being placed à la suite. So I can still call myself an Oldenburger today. On my appointment in 1896 as Chief of Staff to the 8th Army Corps at Koblenz, I came for the first time into close contact with our Rhine provinces. The high spirits and friendly attitude of the Rhinelanders were particularly pleasant to me. To tell the truth, I had to get used to their habit of sliding over the serious questions of life, as also to their temperament, which is more sentimental than that of the North Germans. The course of our historical development and the difference in geographical and economic conditions entirely explain certain contrasts of thought and feeling. But the view that this involves the necessity of separating the Rhineland from Prussia seems to me an outrage and base ingratitude. The merry life on the Rhine had me too under its spell, and I spent many a happy time there. At the start, my general was General von Falkenstein, who was known to me when I was at the Great General Staff as the head of a section, and also at the War Ministry as the director of my department. However, he was soon succeeded by His Royal Highness the Grand Duke of Baden. I was to stand at the side of this royal officer for 3.5 years. I remember these years as among the best of my life. His noble mind, in which dignity united with charming cordiality, his typically unflagging sense of duty combined with his soldierly manner and talents, quickly won him the affection and confidence of all his subordinates, as well as of the Rhenish population. It was while I was Chief of Staff that the 8th Corps had Kaiser maneuvers in 1897. His Majesty the Kaiser and King was satisfied with what he saw both at the review and in the field. The festivities at Koblenz were also marked by the unveiling of the monument to the Emperor William I at the German Quadrangle, that beautiful spot at which the Moselle joins the Rhine, opposite the fortress of Ehrenbreitstein. As the result of my employment for nearly 4 years as Chief of Staff of an Army Corps, I was so advanced in seniority that there was now no question of my appointment to the command of an infantry brigade. At the conclusion of that period, I was therefore appointed to the command of the 28th Division at Karlsruhe in 1900. I obeyed this command, emanating from His Majesty, with quite special satisfaction. My previous official relations with the Grand Duke's heir secured me the lasting goodwill of their Royal Highnesses the Grand Duke and Grand Duchess, a goodwill which was extended to my wife. Erich made us very happy. In addition, we had the splendid country of Baden, with all its natural beauties and its warm-hearted inhabitants, and Karlsruhe with all its wealth of art and science, not to mention its society, less concerned with details, which embraced all professional circles. In the division, all three arms were united for the first time under one command. The duties of a divisional commander are therefore more varied, and demand a sphere of activity which is principally concerned with the great business of war. With a feeling of deep gratitude, I left Karlsruhe in January 1905, when the confidence of my all-highest warlords summoned me to the command of the 4th Army Corps. In assuming my new duties, I took over a position of unlimited responsibility, a position which is usually held longer than other military posts, and on which the holder, like the commander of a regiment, sets the stamp of his personality. I myself pursued the principles that had previously guided me, and I think I may claim some success. The affection of my subordinates, to which I had always attached high importance as one of the mainsprings of efficiency, was, at any rate, expressed in the most moving way when I left this splendid post after 8¼ years. As early as the first year, I had the honor to present my Army Corps to His Majesty in the Kaiser maneuvers, which began with a review on the battlefield of Rossbach. His Majesty expressed his gratitude, which I gladly attributed to my predecessors and my troops. I had the distinction of being presented to Her Majesty the Empress during these maneuvers. This first meeting was to be followed by others in more serious times, when I could appreciate more and more how much this noble lady meant to her exalted husband, her fatherland, and myself. In my time, the 4th Army Corps was in the army inspection of His Royal Highness Prince Leopold of Bavaria. In him I knew a superb leader and splendid soldier. We were to meet again later in the Eastern Theater of War. The prince then placed himself under my orders in the most generous manner in the interests of the whole situation, although he was substantially senior to me in the service. In December 1908, at His Majesty's command, I and the then General von Billow, whose corps also belonged to the army inspection of the prince, took part at Munich in the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the entry of His Royal Highness into the service. On this occasion, we had the honor to be most graciously received by His Royal Highness, the Venerable Prince Regent Leopold. Magdeburg, our station, is often not appreciated as it should be by those who do not know it. It is a fine old town, and its broad way and venerable cathedral ought to be of great interest to sightseers. Since its fortifications were dismantled, their place has been taken by imposing suburbs fulfilling all modern requirements. Extensive parks have been laid out to make up for what the country round Magdeburg lacks in natural beauties. Theaters, concerts, museums, and lectures see to the representation of art and science. It will thus be seen that it is possible to have a pleasant time there when off duty, especially if as agreeable society is available as fell to our lot. Social life in the town was supplemented by social life at the courts of Brunswick, Dessau, and Altenburg, as well as at numerous country houses. It would take too long to mention them all by name. But I have particularly grateful memories of our annual several days visit to my venerable and fatherly friend, General Count von Wartensleben, now 90 years of age, at Cairo. Nor was there any lack of sport. Quite apart from the well-known excellent hare and pheasant shooting to be obtained in the province of Saxony, the court hunting at Letzlingen, Mosekau near Dessau, Blankenberg in the Harz and Altenburg, as well as drives and deer stalking on several private estates, guaranteed us plenty of wild boar, fallow deer, red deer, roe deer, and game shooting. All this time, the resolution to retire from the army was taking shape in my mind. My military career had carried me much farther than I had ever dared to hope. There was no prospect of war, and as I recognized that it was my duty to make way for younger men, I applied in the year 1911 to be allowed to retire. As the hand of legend has descended upon this unimportant event also, I declare emphatically that this step was not the result of any disagreement, whether of an official or private nature. It was anything but easy for me to put an end to a relationship that had lasted for years, a relationship that was very dear to me, and more especially to part from my Fourth Corps, for which I had a great affection. But it had to be. I never suspected that within a few years I should gird on the sword again and, like my men, be permitted to serve my army corps, my emperor and empire, my king and fatherland once again. In the course of my career, I have learned to know almost all the German tribes. I believe I am therefore in a position to judge what a wealth of the most valuable qualities our nation has at its disposal, and to say that hardly any other country in the world possesses, in the versatility of its people, so many conditions precedent to an abounding intellectual and moral life as Germany.
This concludes today's reading of Out of My Life, by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.